All right, welcome back. So this time we're moving on to periodization of the annual plan. Hopefully you'll remember that in the last two lectures we covered how to construct individual workouts, and then we built up from there and we talked about the construction of a microcycle, so a 1 week set of workouts, and then a little bit about a macro or mesocycle, depending upon which terminology you want to use. But you know that building up from a microcycle to a 2 to 6 week training block, and then now we're talking about the annual plan, which, like I said before, is kind of an interesting way of laying it out, because the reality is when you're constructing a plan, you actually start with the annual plan, and as your anchor points you use the big competitions that you want to prepare for, whether that is, you know, nationals, conference championships, or individual meets, if you're talking about like track or powerlifting, weightlifting, those kinds of things. And then you kind of build out from those anchor points. So the way these last three chapters have been laid out is kind of the inverse of that, where we're starting with what are we doing on a given day, what are we doing during the week, what are we doing over the course of 2 months, and then this chapter is what are we doing over the course of the year. So this one actually rehashes a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about quite a bit. So I'm going to try to make this one relatively quick and not belabor too many of the points, because it covers a lot of information that we've already gone over. Speaking of, so this stuff you're familiar with. So the goal of an annual plan is to maximize physiological adaptation, which of course is a prerequisite for improved performance. So when we apply a training stimulus, the body is going to adapt. So for example, if you engage in endurance training, over the course of several weeks, you'll have higher blood volume, including higher plasma volume and higher red blood cell count. And so because of that, you're able to deliver oxygen to the working muscles more effectively, produce energy aerobically more effectively. And so because of that, that enables higher performance. So in response to that training stimulus, the body adapts in a very specific way. Because of the adaptation, we get higher performance, right? And so that's the whole goal of the annual plan, is to manipulate different training stimuli to produce those physical and physiological adaptations that enable higher performance. And so, of course, the three phases of an annual plan, you've got the preparatory phase, the competitive phase, and the transition phase. The preparatory phase, as you know, has a couple of subphases. But in terms of what the preparatory phase does, it makes some of those, or helps the athlete make some of those basic adaptations that they're going to need to achieve a high level of performance. So primarily it's going to establish that physical base. We can work on technical stuff, so having the athlete work on their throwing form, their serving form, those kinds of things. Sometimes we'll work on those during the preparatory phase, especially later in the preparatory phase. But in general, when people conceptualize the preparatory phase, usually we're thinking of establishing a physical and physiological base. We're trying to get them in good enough shape in terms of cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, agility, that they can perform the movements of their sport, that they can perform them effectively, and that they can perform them repeatedly. So that's the idea behind the preparatory base, or the preparatory phase, is establishing primarily that physical base. As you can see there, it can be 3 to 6 months depending on the sport and the type of annual plan, also depending upon the age of the athlete. Or more specifically on the training age of the athlete. So if you've got a younger athlete, an athlete who is, 10, 11, 12, kind of in that range, that prepubertal athlete, you're probably going to have a longer preparatory phase. We're going to do things with them where we're going to probably spend some time working on technique, learning how to dribble, learning how to stick handle, whatever it is that they need to do as the basics of the sport, but also enable them to practice and perform some of the movements that they're going to need to perform during the sport. So whether that is things like change of direction, sprinting, those kinds of things. So the younger the athlete in terms of training age, the longer that preparatory phase tends to be. We also see longer preparatory phases in endurance sports. So in some endurance sports, you're going to see that the preparatory phase is actually twice as long as the competitive phase. So more endurance-based things tend to have longer preparatory phases. So of course, preparatory phase has a couple of subphases. So the first is general preparation, which, as we've discussed previously, you're working on multilateral development. You're having them do, work on general aerobic fitness, some level of muscle strength, trying to get some anatomical adaptation, that kind of stuff. And so the general preparatory phase is marked by high training volume, so lots of sets, lots of miles, but low to moderate intensity. So if we're doing 3 or 4 sets on a particular strength exercise, we're going to be doing relatively high number of repetitions, so between 8 and 12 repetitions, maybe as many as like 15 repetitions, those kinds of things. So again, there you've got relatively high volume, lots of sets, lots of reps, but relatively low intensity. Same kind of thing with our endurance athletes. A relatively high volume of mileage, but they're not going to be doing lots of really high intensity stuff, not doing lots of really fast running, really fast cycling, etc. in that general preparation phase. As we get closer to the season and we move on to the specific preparation subphase, again, we're going to more closely mimic the demands of the sport, so we're going to speed up. If we're talking about our endurance athletes, they're going to run, cycle, row faster. Or if we're talking about our team sport athletes, the movements that they're going to perform are going to more closely mimic what they're going to do in their sport. And also, we're going to try to more closely mimic the metabolic demands of the sport. So as we've discussed before, by invoking similar work-rest ratios. So like one of the examples I gave before was, in college basketball, where you've got a media timeout every 4 minutes. You have a work-rest ratio set up around the interval sprint nature of basketball, but then also around that timeout that is coming approximately every 4 minutes. So of course we move from the preparatory phase on to the competitive phase. And so what we're trying to do in the competitive phase, remember the key takeaway there is we're trying not to lose too much. So we're trying to hang on to what we've developed in terms of a physical and physiological base. But on top of that, once we move into the competitive phase, the focus shifts from physical and physiological to more technical and tactical types of development that we're going for. So obviously we're going to spend more time actually going through plays. That would be tactical development. Or we're going to spend more time having the athlete work on their form, with serving or spiking or whatever the actual sporting components or sporting movements involved in their competition are. And so the competitive phase has a couple of sub-phases. So there's the pre-competitive phase. So that's preseason games. Again, could also be considered non-conference or non-district games. Scrimmages would fall into that as well. And so the idea there is that we're going to use those competitive environments, I guess if you will, those competitive scenarios to evaluate the athlete's technical, tactical, and physiological abilities, right? So we're going to see if they can withstand the physical and physiological strain, but we're also going to see if they can know where they go on a particular play, if they can make the throw that they need to make, if they can make the block that they need to make, those kinds of things. And so that's what we're going to use the pre-competitive subphase for. One of the things you'll see, especially as we move on into Chapter 9 and the taper, and you've kind of seen it some as we've gone along here, is that the authors stress at length that you can really only peak for, if you're thinking about team sports, you can really only peak for 2 to 3 competitions per year, and that you can only maintain peak performance for somewhere between 7 to 14 days. And so one of the ways that they sort of present this idea of peaking is that you want to pick out really important competitions. So again, things like the conference championships, or really important opponents like, rivalry games, or whoever you need to beat in the conference schedule in order to win the conference championship. They really go to great lengths to talk about that. You build the schedule out from there, so that the athletes will peak for that particular competition. That's one of the criticisms, to be honest, of periodization, is that the original model was designed for Olympic athletes, right? Because again, it came from the Soviet system, and so the reason the Soviets were trying to gear up their athletes for these international performances, to perform well at the Olympics, to show that basically their system of government, their system of living was superior, as evidenced by a look at the performance of our athletes, right? And so that's kind of how this system came about. And so again, one of the criticisms there is that this is really geared toward having an athlete peak, for national championships, for Olympic trials, and then for the Olympics, not so much for team sports. Because, if you're thinking about, like as mentioned before, I'm a big college football fan, to say that you're only going to be at peak performance for 2 or 3 games a year is a little bit problematic because, yeah, you've got, some cupcake opponents in there, but you still have to be in pretty good condition for even some of those types of opponents. You probably have more than 2 to 3 hard games or 2 to 3 hard competitions on your schedule per year. So that's kind of one of the primary criticisms of periodization is that concept. So that builds on or comes out of my discussion of the pre-competitive phase, the idea that sometimes the way the authors construe this pre-competitive versus competitive discussion is basically that you really have to focus on just a handful of competitions per year, and everything else is more like evaluative, and you're not going to be at your peak, but that's okay. Hopefully you'll still perform well enough to win. Like I said, in certain sports like football, especially big time Division I college football, there's not a lot of margin for error. If you lose one game, probably not going to the playoff. So it becomes difficult to say, well, we're only going to peak for 2 or 3 competitions a year. But that's a big aside. All right, so from the pre-competitive subphase, we move from non-conference games into conference games where the wins matter more so that hopefully we can win the conference championship. So that's our main competitive subphase. So we're going to have an increase in intensity there, an increase in load. We may see a little bit of a decrease in volume. And remember that in terms of calculating overall training load, we also need to consider how much time we're spending on technical and tactical training. So even though they're not spending as much time running or as much time in the weight room, they're not doing like general training, they are still devoting a lot of mental energy to figuring out the tactics of the sport, watching film, going through chalk talk sessions, those kinds of things, and then also working on perfecting their technique of their shot or their serve, that kind of stuff. All right, so more on the main competitive subphase. So one of the things that we'll talk about in the tapering chapter is that you really only want to do like a formal taper, meaning 8 to 14 days of reduced volume. You really only want to do that 2 to 3 times a year, because the more often you do it, you're probably going to deload the athlete so much that you're going to hamper their gains, but also it becomes less effective. And you see kind of a similar thing with glycogen loading, where the athlete will deplete and then glycogen load to supercompensate and store extra glycogen in the muscles. The more often you do that, the less effective it becomes. So typically, the athletes only do that a handful of times per year as well. So this first picture here is an endurance-based sport. And so these are the 2 weeks or the 2 microcycles leading up to a 2-day competition. So let's say a track meet. And so what you can see here is that this athlete is going to maintain relatively high volume. And so you got 2 days of high intensity, off day on Sunday. Again, 2 days of relatively high intensity, lower volume here, off day on Friday, and then the competition. As opposed to more of a sprint type sport, you're going to see a pretty significant reduction in volume, especially during that second microcycle. So one of the things with tapering is that, and again, the whole next talk is devoted to this, but one of the things with tapering is that you want to maintain the intensity. And so you can see there's a couple times here. So this Wednesday, they're working above race pace for the sprint athletes. They're probably doing, if you got somebody that runs the 100, the 200, they're probably doing shorter sprints, maybe 10s or 20-meter sprints, really working on being explosive. So in doing that, they're working above race pace. So their intensity is above race pace here on this Wednesday and again here on this Monday. So we want to maintain the intensity, and in some cases even increase the intensity a little bit, but decrease the volume. That's how the taper works. And so you're seeing that here. On the strength training frequency, dropped to 1 to 2 times a week. Depends on the nature of the sport. If it's more of a power sport, like this second diagram is, they may do more like 2 to 3 times a week. So if you've got a sprinter, they may still lift 3 times a week during this first microcycle and then 2 times a week here. If you got more of an endurance athlete, it may be 2 here, 1 here. So it depends on the demands of the sport. If it's more of an endurance sport, you're going to see fewer strength training sessions, more of a power sport, you're going to see more strength training sessions. So as far as I recall, this is the only place where they mention this special preparation period. And so the idea here is that leading up to the biggest competition of the year, or one of the bigger competitions for the year, that you're going to spend extra time working on tactics or psychological preparation. And so because of that, that's going to comprise an increase, or at least a relatively stable training load because of the increase, or yeah, let's go with that. Because of the increase in working on tactical information and psychological techniques, so working on improving or maintaining arousal. So arousal is how, it's hard to describe in a sporting sense, but like think about it, if you are really excited right before competition, right? That's a high state of arousal. Or if you are half asleep, that's a low state of arousal. So teaching the athletes to psych themselves up to get mentally ready for competition, those techniques, that'll take up, again, some mental energy. And so maybe we're going to spend some time in the week leading up to the main competition working on relaxation, or working on being able to prepare themselves for that competition. Transition phase. So you're going to get rid of the fatigue that they've accumulated over the course of the season. You're going to have them do probably some sort of a different activity just to kind of get away from the sport, to get a mental break. So get them off the court for a little while, or get them out of the ice rink for a little while and doing something else that'll give them a mental break. But one of the things that we can do is, this active rest here, so we can have them do different activities that are similar in physiological nature, or similar in movement nature. So you can have your hockey players play soccer. You could have your you could have your soccer players play basketball, those kinds of things. So you still have them doing like interval sprint type stuff, so they don't lose all the adaptations that they've made, but it's different. It's different, a little bit different movements, but again, similar energy systems. So we can get them a mental break, we can get them somewhat of a physical break, but we try to hang on to as many of those adaptations that they've made during the preparatory phase as we can. That alternative training may include other things. So I've got my tennis lady, or my tennis player here, doing yoga. So it doesn't necessarily all need to be physiologically similar. You could have them doing something like this, where they're working on, that's part of that mental break, but also strengthening the muscles in a different way, right? I put this slide on here, so this is detraining effects. So all the adaptations that you lose over the course of 4 weeks or more than 4 weeks. And actually the main reason I put this on here was so you have a list, an idea of a bunch of the different adaptations that the body makes to training. So for example, and we've talked about most of these, in response to endurance training, you're going to see an increase. So all these things are going to decrease, of course, during detraining, because you stop training, or most of these things will decrease because you stop training. But with training, you're going to get the opposite, right? So you're going to get an increase in maximal oxygen uptake, also known as aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, because the heart becomes a more effective pump, got a little bit higher number of red blood cells. The muscles have, down here, more capillaries. They've also got more mitochondria, which is in there. And so then that allows you to deliver and use oxygen more effectively, right? So I left this on here kind of to give you an idea of all the different adaptations that we make in response to training. So these I don't want to spend a ton of time on, because in some ways I think diagrams like this are overly complicated. And I think, I mentioned before that sometimes people, when they start to try to learn about periodization, pretty quickly are like, man, that is too complicated. I'm not even going to mess with that. And so I don't think diagrams like these help for that. I think they are useful for conceptualizing what we're talking about, because you've got the different months of the calendar here. You've got the 3 big phases: preparatory, competitive, transition. Then you've got the sub phases on here. And then you can kind of see that relationship between intensity, where it's increasing here, volume is increasing, but once we get to the competitive phase, you can see that inverse relationship, where you're going to see volume is going to start to drop while intensity increases. And then we have this other thing, the peaking or the readiness curve. The authors call it both, but the idea here is that they are going to steadily improve their state of readiness or peak their performance, especially once we get to that main competition of the year. So this would be an athlete, or for an athlete who is participating in a team sport, because you can see official league competitions here. And so during the actual season, so this is somebody like football player, soccer, basketball, etc. See, they've got their preseason here, and then the main part of the season is in here. They're going to have relatively low volume, but again, relatively high intensity. So you can see, they're spending a lot of time here, here at 90% of their max intensity. So what they're again trying to do is to hang on to the adaptations that they've made. So like I said, I think they're useful for conceptualizing that relationship between volume and intensity and how the whole training calendar lays out. But I do think that these things get a little overly complicated as well. There are times where, so for example, there even I find that one to be pretty off-putting. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts in a training program. We have to consider volume, intensity, frequency, all the competitions, how much are we traveling, where are we traveling to? If it's international competition, well, then that's going to disrupt their sleep cycle, and that's a longer travel time. And then also we've got the nutritional aspect of it as well. But again, even I visually find that sort of a depiction of training to be a little bit off-putting and potentially overcomplicated. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. All right, so typical annual plans, we've talked about this. So a monocycle indicates that you've got one peak. So we see monocycles, go back one more, for our team sport athletes, where we're gonna try to have them peak, for the conference championship, national championship, whatever it is. And then we also see it for athletes who are engaged in one really big competition per year. So you could see this with somebody who is, let's say, training for a marathon, something like that. So more of a recreational type athlete. So they just need one peak for that one big event that they're going to. Bicycles. I've mentioned before that this is something we see with athletes that have two sport seasons. So if somebody, if you've got two tennis seasons, for example, so like an individual and a team season, you would see a bicycle setup. So they would peak for their individual season and then again for the team season. You see it with things like track as well, indoor-outdoor track would have a similar bicycle type of a setup. So with those, one of the big differences between the two, I guess a couple of things I would point out. So the first is that this unloading phase between the two tends to be pretty short. So unloading phases can be as long as 6 weeks. But typically, if you've got something like this, so like indoor-outdoor track, the unloading phase is only going to be a week. Now here, this transition phase, or I should probably call this a transition phase. This transition phase here is only going to be about a week. This transition phase will be longer because now the whole thing is done. We need to get away from the track. We need to get away from our sport-specific exercises for a little while. And so that transition phase, that second one, will be more in that 4 to 6 week kind of a range. But knowing that in doing so and taking that long away from the sport, we're going to reduce a lot of that fatigue. We're going to help them be more mentally fresh, but at the same time, they're going to lose a lot of those physiological adaptations that they've made. But the good news is, once they've made them once, they tend to come back more quickly. So that's our bicycle. The other thing I would say, or wanted to point out, is that after this short transition phase, this preparatory phase is also relatively short. So you can see this one here, the first one is 2.5 months, almost 3 full months. This one here is only about 2 months. So that second preparatory phase doesn't need to be quite as long because they're starting from a greater level of fitness, if you will, greater level of readiness for that second peak cycle. Tricycle. So you can see this with international athletes, so like track athletes that are trying to gear up for nationals, Olympic trials, and then the Olympics potentially, or maybe conference championships, or like one big meet, conference championships, and then the national championships, those kinds of things. So that's where we typically see tricycles, where they're going to have 3 obvious peaks throughout the year. Viewed another way, and so hopefully you'll have a similar chart to this on your own annual plan, because remember, I want it to align to the calendar, so they've got the calendar here. This stuff we don't need. This is all pretty superfluous. So you got the calendar, and how that calendar aligns to the three big phases, the preparatory, competitive, and transition phases, and then what we're doing in each. So as far as strength goes, so these are the different biomotor abilities. So as far as strength goes, here we're in the anatomical adaptation phase, maximal strength, and then power. Endurance, we're doing aerobic stuff, and then probably some more anaerobic type stuff. And then general speed here, so again, working on things like technique, and then working on specific speed with more similar work-rest ratios to what they're going to need during their sport, as well as like any change of direction stuff they would need to do during their sport. You can also get rid of testing dates and then medical control dates, which I assume they're referring to drug testing there, so we can get rid of that as well. So ideally, your training plans would look, like I said, similar to this with the months, with the different training phases, and then the different biomotor abilities you're working on. I would also leave off nutrition. Bicycle, same setup. We're just dividing it into competitive 1 and competitive 2. So you just add in 2 of everything. And again, that the things in the second preparatory phase will be shorter. And you might not really even need much of an anatomical adaptation in the second preparatory phase. Tricycle, same concept. Again, this is the really complicated one. This one, in addition to all of those other things, also has, so we've got our physical preparation, we've got our technical preparation curve is on, those are down here, sorry. Physical preparation, technical preparation, tactical preparation, how much time we're devoting to each of those. And then we have our intensity curve, our peaking curve here, our volume curve, which on here is black, but on here is blue. So, yeah. All right. So in terms of the elements of an annual plan, so making one. So the first thing you're going to do, and this is, again, review type stuff. The first thing you're going to do in making an annual plan is to perform what is often referred to as a needs analysis, which is, an analysis of the sport. What are the metabolic characteristics or the energetic characteristics of the sport? So it's aerobic, anaerobic, ATP, phosphocreatine, glycolytic, aerobic, those kinds of things, as well as the movement demands of the sport, and then again the demands of the athletes. So based on the needs of the sport and the abilities of the athlete, then we look at, well, what do we need to develop? What strength qualities are needed and for the sport, and also where is the athlete lacking? So that could be, do they need more muscle strength, do they need more muscle size, more power, those kinds of things. If they need to add more muscle size, for example, so if we're looking at anatomical adaptation, if they need to add more muscle size, well, then we're going to need to lengthen the preparatory phase and spend more time doing relatively high volume training, and then get into our maximal strength phase. And then in terms of selection of exercises, things that are appropriate to the sport movements. So, for most of our sports that are sprint type sports, things like squatting are appropriate because it mimics that powerful hip and knee extension that we're going to need during our sports. Doesn't include ankle plantar flexion or ankle extension, viewed another way. So that's typically where the Olympic lifts come in. In terms of developing speed, again, review here. So are they working on acceleration? That is alactic, so they're going to do really high velocity sprints, but with relatively long rest periods. So something like football would fall into this category most of the time, where you'd have like a 6-second sprint and maybe a 1 minute of rest. That would tend to fall into the alactic area. But lactic speed short, so you've got, again, about 6 seconds of sprinting, but a little bit less rest there. And so you're going to generate some lactate because of those short rest periods. So if you're doing, sticking with the football example, if you're doing a hurry up type of an offense where you're just rolling from one play to the next, you're going to shorten those rest periods. And so with that, they're going to start to generate some lactic acid. And then lactic speed long is sprints over 8 seconds. So you could see that, like, so with soccer, for example, you could see kind of this combination between these two. Looking at rest intervals, we've talked about those before. Is the speed that they need linear, so straight line, or do they need to do a bunch of change of direction stuff? In terms of developing endurance, how much of what they do is aerobic? Are they, a marathon runner, somebody who's going to go for hours and do aerobic that whole time, or are they going to be anaerobic where they're going to generate lots and lots of lactate and they need to be able to turn it over quickly? And then is it continuous? You know, in the case of something like a 1 mile race where it's going to be generating lots of lactate, but you're going continuously, or is it something like a soccer player who's going to do lots of repeated sprints and generate lots of lactate from the repeated sprint and rest setup? After the season, you want to evaluate the plan. So did the athlete achieve the goals they were going for? If so, great. If not, why not? What are some things that we could look at changing? So did they maintain their conditioning, or did we kind of run out of gas at the end of the season? Did they run out of gas at the end of games? Did they peak too early? Maybe we increased the volume or the intensity too quickly, and so they peaked in the middle of the season, and then we sort of sputtered to the finish line. And so then how do we adapt our training load in the following annual plan to fix that? And then based on that, so based on how everything went last year, where are we now and what can we expect to achieve? So this again ties back into those SMART goals that we talked about all the way back in that first talk. So you can see planning for a volleyball player. So we're going to work on improving their leg strength to increase their jumping ability, but we're also going to take into account technical things they need to work on, so improving their serving consistency, and then tactical things. So these are the kinds of offenses that we run, and so we're going to have them be able to perform the technique within the constraints of the tactics that we use. So one of the things we'll talk about in Chapter 9 in the tapering chapter is about setting up the competition calendar, and again related to critiques of periodization and the ways that this text is laid out. They seem to talk a lot more about, or talk about it as if coaches have a lot more leeway than they do in terms of the competition calendar, and I'll talk about that more next time. So the other thing you're going to want to do is figure out how you're going to evaluate. So, we talked about that you want to do your tests at the end of the different phases. So you're going to do a test at the end of the preparatory phase, and then potentially you could do one at the end of the competitive phase. You could do them right before unloading cycles during like the general prep, moving into the specific prep. You could do one set at the end of general prep, one test at the end of general prep, and then one test at the end of specific prep. In thinking about the tests, and there are whole classes on tests and measures, but what you want to do is make them specific to the needs of the sport. So you want to measure things like power, aerobic endurance, sprint ability, whatever, but again, make them as specific as possible to the needs of the sport, so that you don't just generate a test that doesn't really tell you anything about how they're going to perform. So for example, oftentimes people will knock the evaluation of bench press. Like why would you measure bench press performance? Like how often are they lying on their back and pressing something that is fairly, I was gonna say immobile, but like if even for a football lineman, if you're pushing against an opponent, one, you're not on your back, and two, they're moving as well. And so maybe just doing bench press is not the best evaluation of pushing ability, right? So you'll hear that criticism fairly commonly. So make sure the tests that you choose to include replicate the skills, the movements, the energetic demands of the sport. And that's it. So next time we'll move on to tapering, and then that'll be the last of the new stuff for the second test. So the second test will include chapters 5 through 9. So we'll see you for the talk about tapering.